Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation today. And I would like to preface, I might have some very sad news about what's going on in the world today, so I apologize. I'm not the bearer of great news, but I'll try to give you a comprehensive update about what's happening internationally and what's happening here at home as well for asylum seekers. So in general, as you may know, before COVID-19 hit, we were already seeing very high numbers of displacements internationally. Close to 80 million people are forcibly displaced in the world. 26 million of those are refugees, and 20 million of those fall under UNHCR's mandate. So about 4.2 million of those individuals are asylum seekers, and then we're seeing quite a high number of internally displaced persons as well. So this was before COVID hit. And these are just some general statistics about the types of people that have been forcibly displaced around the world. Among that population of 80 million, about 40% of those are children who have been forcibly displaced, and 85% are hosted in developing countries. So the majority of refugees and asylum seekers around the world are currently hosted in countries like Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany is the only Western country that, that hosts quite a high number of refugees and asylum seekers. Otherwise, they're all pretty much hosted in neighboring countries to these conflicts. So it was quite a challenge and challenging situation that UNHCR is responding to internationally before the pandemic, which has been currently exacerbated by the pandemic. And we're seeing a number of different issues that we have started and have worsened because of the pandemic and borders closing. So we have a website for COVID-19 that you could visit. The link is at the bottom of this slide. And this website provides an update on what's happening internationally regarding borders and restrictions to movement. So as you can see, this is just a screenshot of current conditions worldwide. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there were more borders closed, more countries that have been closed off to access for asylum seekers. That has slowly been improving while the numbers had gone down, and now they're starting to go up again. So we're hoping we won't see more border closures for asylum seekers, but we don't know, we can't predict that. So currently we're seeing about 77 countries worldwide where restrictions on access to territory apply, with some exceptions or full exceptions for asylum seekers. So that's why you see Canada in a light blue there, since there's some exceptions currently, and I'll talk about those soon. And then there's other countries that have completely denied access to asylum. So there's about 67 of those worldwide right now that we've been tracking. The US is one of them. As you can see, there's some other countries such as Brazil, Peru, in our region of the world that have completely closed their borders to asylum seekers. And then there's 27 only worldwide that have no COVID-related restrictions. So if you go to that website, it's actually really useful. There's other sections to it where you could track different types of data from around the world. You could also filter by region and by country. So I suggest you guys visit it. I could also share the link in the conversation if you guys want to take a look at it. So our current challenges worldwide right now, as you can see, because of the border closures, is responding on top of the massive displacement, is responding to a pandemic in developing countries with weakening healthcare systems. In many places that we operate, we don't have access to even adequate water for persons that we serve, or soap. So for example, in Yemen, where one of my friends works, when the pandemic started, they didn't even have water or soap to distribute. And then ports were closed in terms of delivery of material. So they couldn't even get that type of material to respond to the pandemic for the internally displaced, for the refugees, and for the asylum seekers that found themselves in Yemen. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing. There's already very weakened healthcare systems where the majority of the people that we serve live. So it's really hard to respond to an emergency on top of an emergency. In addition, we're seeing an increase in the number of conflicts around the world that is exacerbating displacement even further on top of the pandemic. So you may have heard, for example, currently there's a situation in Ethiopia where conflict has sparked again. And we're seeing about 4,000 people per day since November 10th crossing into Sudan. So our operation in Sudan is now trying to respond to the needs of I believe about 27,000 people who have arrived since the beginning of November, on top of limited resources due to the pandemic. So this is one of the challenges that we're seeing in the field, or one of the multiple challenges we're seeing in the field right now. We're seeing greater numbers of internally displaced persons as well, with access to territory being denied in numerous countries. So people are being unable to flee the situations where they find themselves in conflict because borders are closed. Which of course, internally displaced populations and responding to the needs of internally displaced populations are quite challenging, much more challenging than responding to asylum seekers or refugees that are coming into another country, since they're where the conflict has started. So that's another challenge that we're seeing currently. We also have a shortage of medical equipment to respond to the needs during the pandemic. We also have a shortage of testing. So we don't know in the multiple countries where we work what the levels of COVID are, if they're really high, and if the persons that we serve are being greatly impacted. It's really hard for us to track, since it's really difficult to test and trace and figure out what the level of impact COVID is having on the populations. We just see people getting sick. We assume that it's COVID, but there's no definitive way in some operations in seeing what the issue is and if it actually is COVID, and if we need to ramp up certain medical equipment or delivery. So some of the actions that we have been taking internationally to try to respond to this situation is we've started increasing distribution of shelter materials, basic necessities, sanitary and hygienic products. The picture that you see is one of our staff members in Iran, actually. And Iran was a country that was pretty hard hit by COVID. So a lot of the resources that we provided to refugees and asylum seekers and internally displaced person also serve the host community, because they're also suffering from the pandemic. We've also increased our financial assistance to refugees. So this is what we call cash-based assistance. In the past, we would offer cash-based assistance or initiatives to refugees and asylum seekers directly, so they could buy their own things. They could determine what they need and use that cash to obtain that. We've increased that because we've seen during the pandemic it's really effective in terms of them being able to provide for themselves and deciding what they need in order to get the basic necessities, instead of just handing them out sanitizers or diapers or things like that. We've also increased our support to governments in infections prevention and health responses. We're trying to shore up the medical systems where we operate any way we can. And we've also increased our advice and practical information regarding preventative measures for refugees. So you'll see, I don't know if you'll see on social media, we do have a lot of operations who've now put in place social distancing measures to deliver goods and services. They've put in place mask requirements, distribution of masks, to make it much more easier. We are staying and delivering is what they call it. We are continuing to serve people, but we've just modified the way that we do it so we could continue to work in the field. And we've also increased or strengthened our monitoring and measurings to guarantee the respects of people who have been uprooted. So we continually report to our offices in Panama for the Americas and our offices at the headquarters about the current situation in the countries which we operate. And all of this information feeds into that website that I shared with you. That we update on a regular basis. I believe we report about, on a bi-weekly basis. regarding our response to the pandemic and any emerging issues. So that way we are aware of what's happening on the ground and are able to respond in a much quicker fashion. So some of the things that we have been delivering, you'll see since the start of the pandemic, we've procured about 24 million masks, 1.4 million gowns, oxygen tanks have been procured. You know, in a lot of places where we operate, we don't have access to things like ventilators or oxygen tanks or things like that. So that's been quite a difficult thing to obtain, but essential for us to try to get for the populations that we serve, but also even for our staff. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had operations that were basically, staff were stuck. We had no medevac, and a lot of operations had limited health services for the staff, even for them. So it was quite a challenging situation to respond to, because we also had staff who got sick, and we had to try to respond to that without having access to helicopter medevac or being able to get them out of the country. So quite an operational challenge for UNHCR. Now, as you know, this has impacted asylum in Canada as well. We're not alone in terms of the pandemic having its impacts here. So there have been 3 stages to what's been happening at the border, I would say. So early March, there were some closures, but really not that much in terms of impact on access to territory for asylum seekers. They did do some health screenings at the beginning. They did provide some quarantine measures, but then that changed on March 21st, where the border was closed with an agreement with the US that's deemed as a temporary agreement. Where persons are directed back to the US and they've gotten assurances from the US government that those directed back temporarily would not be subject to detention or to refoulement. And now there's an additional exception. Now they're allowing persons in, and this is since April, they're allowing persons in who qualify for a safe third country agreement exception. So if they arrive at a port of entry and qualify under the Safe Third Country Agreement, then they could claim asylum in Canada. So effectively, this means that the people most impacted by the border closures are those who arrive irregularly, which used to be one of our highest populations for asylum seekers, would be irregular arrivals, particularly in Quebec and in BC as well. But that number has drastically dropped now with the border closure. And as you know, inland claims are still possible, and we've seen also a significant decrease in detention. I believe the last statistic that I received was about a 90% decrease in detention of asylum seekers specifically during the same period last year, if you compare it to the same period last year. So it's quite a large decrease. So that's one positive, or some good news, that to come out of this pandemic, there's been a greater use of alternatives to detention, especially for asylum seekers, which I hope will continue after the pandemic. And I think there's some best practices that could be learned about that to continue to use alternatives to detention further down after this pandemic ends, hopefully. So just to go over some statistics, so you'll see here the massive drop in asylum claims in Canada. For the graph on the left, you'll see that the 2020 line is the yellow line. So we have seen in September, those are the latest statistics that we have, the public statistics, there's been a slight increase in asylum claims. And these are mostly due to inland claims increasing. But still, it's a pretty big decrease. Since the pandemic, the first full 9 months of the pandemic in 2020, we've received a total of about 20,000 claims. So that's a 57% decrease compared to the same period last year. And if we look specifically at a 6-month period of April to September, for the full border closure, there's a decrease in 77% compared to the same period last year. So quite a significant drop in terms of the numbers of claimants that we are getting. And that significantly has impacted irregular arrivals. So you'll see from these graphs the progression in the number of irregular arrivals we've seen coming to Canada. So 2016, we didn't have that many, but you saw a spike in 2017, in 2018, and 2019, it was starting to decrease a bit. But then if you look January to September 2020, it's gone down quite a lot. So that's about a decrease of 73% that we've seen since the same period last year. And from April to September, for the first full months of the border closure, that's a 98% decrease. So effectively, that route is pretty much non-existent. So the drop could be attributed to a number of things, obviously the border closure, but we're also seeing less persons coming to the border and being turned back or directed back to the US. There's really not that many in terms of persons who have been directed back to the US under the border closure. And I think part of it is limited restrictions in movement throughout the region in the Americas. It's harder to access the US from certain countries due to the pandemic. So it's harder to fly into the US. It's harder to access the US from Mexico. So we're seeing fewer movement into the US and then consequently fewer people trying to come up to Canada. And I think the message has also been passed, pretty much the borders are closed. So you have fewer people attempting to come into Canada to claim. So of course, this is also having an impact on people who are already here. And I believe I gave a presentation for MAP on the issue of social supports for asylum seekers in Canada. And there's a number of different social supports that they could access. They just listed some of them here, but it does depend province to province. The CERB is now pretty much over as well. So it really is important for asylum seekers to access settlement services in their province because there's different types of benefits that they could access where they are. They could be provincial or a combination of provincial and federal. And that's pretty much it for me in terms of the current situation and what we're looking at here in Canada and abroad. I kind of breezed through that, hoping that some people will have some questions as well. If you want, I could go back to statistics if you have any questions about specifics. I should also qualify as well. Eligibility interviews at IRCC have restarted now. They're taking a max of 9 people per day to ensure social distancing and public health measures. And there's a specific link where you could go get information on that. And they're starting to schedule IRCC eligibility interviews for persons whose interviews were canceled during the pandemic first. So they have priority, and then they'll go down the list of people who claimed inland chronologically. So if you have any questions about that, I could also send the link for information on the eligibility interviews.
Thanks, Azadeh. Yeah, if you could send the link in the chat box. Yeah, okay. Or the Q&A box. Either way, I'll send it out to everybody. Okay. So if anyone has any questions, you can put it in the Q&A box. I have a question. Oh, okay, they're coming in. Oh yeah, we will be sharing the PowerPoint deck. And also this is being recorded. So the deck, all the resources and the recording will be up on the hub, and I'll send out an email to everyone that registered once that's ready. So the first question that came up is, I mean, I know we are focusing on refugee claimants and / asylum seekers, and for anyone joining that's not familiar, that's kind of an interchangeable term. So in refugee law, it's referred to as refugee claimants, but more internationally, it's asylum seekers. So essentially, it's the same. And if you could comment on what's happening with government-sponsored refugees and privately sponsored refugees in Canada.
So basically for resettlement, what we're seeing is at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw pretty much a closure and resettlement due to travel restrictions. So travel was not really happening. But even during that closure for travel for resettlement, luckily, Canada was still allowing emergency resettlement. So we saw some cases be able to make it to Canada under emergency resettlement processes. And those are usually UNHCR referred cases where there's an emergency or an urgent case that needs to be resettled. Recently, there's been a statement that resettlement has started to resume. I'm not too sure that Canada will be able to meet its quotas for the years for resettlement, but there's been an increase in resettlement numbers for next year and the following 3 years, which will make up hopefully for that difference in terms of resettlement. So it's slow, and that's one of the challenges that we are dealing with. People are getting stuck in challenging situations because it's harder and harder to travel. We have people who had been approved to come, received their visa, and then the pandemic hit and they got stuck. So that has been the challenge for us right now in dealing with resettlement. So it's starting to open up a bit more, thankfully, and we're starting to see more and more cases coming in, but it's a very slow process.
Thank you. So we have another question. Okay. So since August 2020, there were many programs and pathways announced by the Ministry of Immigration. In this regard, they have 2 questions. Okay, so the first question is the pathway for asylum seekers who have been working in the healthcare during COVID-19 that will get the permanent residency. Do you know anything about that and when the application will be available for that?
Right, so they're just starting to roll that out. So I'll send out the link for that as well. The application currently, I don't think it's available, but it should be another month or so. It's a very limited type of application for first responders, asylum seekers who are first responders. It's not a very wide criteria. So you really have to make sure that you fall into one of the categories before you apply. I'll send the link for the information on that program and where you could get updates and when they'll launch that. It will take a bit of time for them to set up the program fully.
Great. And then another question is, at the end of October, Canada announced plans to make it easier for more than 1 million temporary students, workers, and asylum seekers living in Canada to become permanent residents. Are asylum seekers eligible for this? Do you have any details on this? Or?
Yeah, so the only program that I'm aware of that asylum seekers are able to access for permanent residence is that announcement for healthcare workers, for asylum seekers who've been in the healthcare sector. You know, asylum seekers could apply, possibly depending on their status and their case, for permanent residence on their humanitarian grounds, but they can't do it if they have an asylum claim in the process. So really the only program that I know of that's really geared towards a response for COVID and increasing pathways would be this one for asylum seekers who've been on the front lines. The other temporary workers and students, they've expanded access and extensions that they could access, but that's really separate from the asylum seeker stream.
Okay, and I think this question was referring to when you were speaking about government-assisted refugees, and
Right.
you know what the quota is for this year.
Sure, I'll send the link for the statistics. I don't have them off my top of my head. Like we haven't met it at all. we've really kind of just barely scratched the surface, but I'll send the link for the numbers. And they've been increased by a couple of thousand for next year. The following year, I'll send that right now in the chat.
Just working through the questions. I'll just give Azadeh this a minute to look for that link, and I've been posting all the links she's been sending because for some reason it's only going to all the panelists when you're sending it, so I'm reposting it to everybody.
Perfect.
And like I said, I will post these on the hub, on the page with the recordings and the PowerPoint deck and everything.
Okay.
And I'll email out the links as well.
Okay, I got the link, so go ahead with the next question.
Okay, great. Okay, so this next question is, what happened to those who attempted to irregularly cross the border during COVID? Were they not eligible to apply for asylum, or what happened there?
So technically, when someone attempts to cross irregularly, what they do now is they capture their biometric information, they capture their basic data, and then they give them a paper, a sheet that says that they're being turned back to the US temporarily because of COVID, and that they should check a website. They give them a website for when they could return to claim asylum. So they're turned back directly to the US, and then they have to check this website to see when they could come back. UNHCR hasn't been fully monitoring. We haven't been asked to monitor direct backs in terms of what happens to them when they get back to the US. There have been a couple of cases that have been flagged to us of persons who have been detained or placed in removal proceedings when they've been returned to the US. And this is very few, but there's been a couple which we're working on, and we're tracking all of the ones that we do receive. So if you hear of any cases of persons who've been directed back who contact you and are currently having issues in the US, please feel free to contact us. There is a specific application that people could do if they've been directed back to the US and are having issues. We usually refer them to counsel in Canada who are working pro bono on some of these cases. They could do a specific type of application to be returned to Canada under a public interest ground. And it's under Section 5 of the Order in Council, which is the order that they created to close the border. So they would do an application under that section. And then it would go directly to Minister Mendicino and Minister Blair usually, and they would their delegate would evaluate the application to see if they should be allowed to return to continue their asylum claim under a public interest ground. So technically, we don't know what happened to everybody, if they've had any trouble when they returned. We had a couple of cases flagged to us. But in general, Canada has received assurances from the US government that people won't be detained or removed while they're waiting to come back to Canada. So once the border opens up again, they will hopefully be able to start scheduling returns or returns to come and continue their asylum claim. And they have all of their information captured the first time they attempted.
Thank you. So we have another question that's a bit more broad. Can you speak to what supports are in place for women specifically, both internationally and within Canada? And can you speak to the challenges that are specific to women, again, both internationally and in Canada?
Okay, so that's a hard one to answer very broadly because it really depends on where you are and what country you're in. In Canada itself, the biggest challenges, I would say, we've seen an increase in domestic violence cases. And specifically, if you see a case of domestic violence in a family of asylum seekers, you might have refugee claimants, you might have women that are a bit more hesitant to come forward and claim that they've been having some issues with their spouse because their status is not, they might feel that their status is not settled yet, that their claim is tied to their husband, and really those types of cases, I would suggest that people go get legal advice from their lawyer and possible support services from counseling groups if there's anything that's flagged to you. It's really a sensitive issue and situation, and it's really important that they know what their rights are in terms of their asylum claim as well if they decide to separate or leave their spouse because of domestic violence issues. So those are really, I think, probably one of the biggest challenges for women currently in Canada who are asylum seekers. For refugees, there's also a rise in domestic violence cases, I believe. There's also difficulties in accessing economic support, especially women with children and single women. We're seeing that internationally as well. Internationally, we're seeing rises in domestic violence. Internationally, we're seeing more single women or single heads of household, women who are leaving where they are currently unsafe. So they have specific needs that we need to respond to because often they're the sole caregiver for their children. So it's really hard in certain operations internationally to provide assistance to these women and these children because of the pandemic has exacerbated their situation and their ability to access economic supports. So this is one of the reasons that we've increased cash-based assistance. So we can directly give them cash so they can decide what they need to spend their money on. We've also increased mental health supports and social supports internationally. for women specifically, because we are seeing a little bit of a gender disparity in terms of the impact of the pandemic.
Thank you. And I think that your comment on domestic violence, we had that same kind of comment when in our past webinar with the Battered Women's Services Society, that they're seeing a huge increase in calls to their helplines. So yeah, unfortunately, that is the case. Okay, the next question is, for individuals who manage to cross the border without inspection or undetected, do they have any problem making an inland claim?
Yeah, so the biggest problem was the fact that the eligibility interviews weren't going ahead due to the pandemic. So I'm glad that they're restarting now. So they could still make a claim. There's no restrictions to them making a claim. Inland claims are still possible. The biggest issue is the eligibility interviews. So now that they're restarting a little bit, hopefully it will be easier access. Of course, if you need an eligibility interview to get a work permit, to get the interim federal health care access. So that was the problem that we were seeing for people who wanted to claim inland. And we've seen a small uptick recently in inland claims. So possibly this restarting of eligibility interviews is starting people to continue on with their claims in Canada once they're able to. But otherwise, there shouldn't be any issue, especially if they cross undetected. We haven't heard of IRCC saying, well, the border was closed, we're going to send you back now. That would kind of defeat the purpose of the COVID border closures and measures, and would be increasing travel and movement, which is pretty much what you don't want to do during a pandemic. So we haven't seen any issues of people turn back once they claim inland if they had crossed undetected so far.
Okay, just a couple more questions and then we'll move on to our next presenter. And then we'll have time at the very end for questions for both speakers. So, keep your questions coming. To your knowledge, have there been any changes to the Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the US?
No, and I think there's been some confusion as well because of the current litigation that's ongoing. So you may know that there's currently a challenge to the Safe Third Country Agreement that's making its way through the courts. So CCR and the Council of Canadian Churches and a number of groups got together and challenged the Safe Third Country Agreement. And they won their case at the lower court level, at the federal court level, who determined that detention conditions in the US basically violated their Section 7 charter rights in Canada, so the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. That is now being appealed by the government to the Federal Court of Appeal. So currently the Federal Court of Appeal has maintained the Safe Third Country Agreement until a decision is made on the appeal. The hearing will be heard in February, late February. So there won't be a decision probably until late next year, probably in the summer or maybe in the fall on that. So currently the Safe Third Country Agreement is still in place. There's been no changes to its requirements, and it's still being implemented. So people who qualify for an exception are still allowed to enter Canada right now to make a claim at the port of entry.
And last question, I think you touched on this, but are eligibility interviews being done in person or are they just all online for now?
So they're in person, and that was one of the biggest challenges with the eligibility interviews, and why they had stopped them is because to do them, they need to look at things like biometrics and take fingerprints and things like that. So that's why they were pretty much stopped. So they're in person. So they're doing 9 per day, about, give or take a few. So still very low in terms of numbers, but they're hoping to increase them hopefully so they could get through the backlog of claims that they have. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And you'll stay with us, and then at the end, if there's any more questions, I'll have those for you as well. Thanks, Azadeh.